Before moving on to the summary, it is necessary to outline two key questions that underpin the entire cycle of the Second Front. First, which war was Stalin preparing for? And second, why, despite the evident militarization of the USSR and preparation for a large-scale war, the beginning of the Soviet-German War turned into a catastrophe, the scale of which only became apparent by the end of the last century? The Communist Party's explanations to the latter question always boiled down to one coherent narrative. History gave us little time. The Soviet government could not modernize and rearm for a great war in just 20 years, inheriting only the Tsarist plow from Nicholas II, which is why Soviet weaponry was totally inferior to that of the German fascist invaders. But the resilient Soviet working people displayed unprecedented mass heroism in world history, overcoming the enemy. Despite the apparent logic of this version, its falsity became clear during the first Khrushchev thaw, with the appearance of translated, albeit in very limited circulation, memoirs of German generals, studies by Western historians, and, from the beginning of Perestroika, the publication of the official list of Soviet mechanized corps before the Soviet-German War, listing their equipment. Adding up the number of tanks in all the corps gives a figure of 13,500 tanks, excluding reconnaissance tanks, in all mechanized corps, whereas the Wehrmacht had only about 4,000 tanks at the start of the invasion of the USSR, which completely shatters the lie about the enemy's overwhelming superiority in tanks. The book by Viktor Suvorov, The Icebreaker, published in 1989, begins with Bukovsky's preface, titled Monument to Human Blindness. The Icebreaker was based solely on the memoirs of Soviet generals and writings by Soviet historians, starting with debunking the myth of backward Russia, which in reality produced high-tech products such as radio components, aviation, submarines, cruisers, and ranked fifth in industrial production in the world and first in Europe in oil extraction. On the basis of this industrial base, as well as factories built during industrialization with money from grain sales and expropriated gold, the USSR created the largest army in the world, the largest tank forces, and the most numerous air force in the world. The Bolsheviks were preparing for nothing other than war.
Лет через 20 после хорошей войны выйти да взглянуть на Советский Союз. Республика так из 30-40. Черт его знает, как хорошо!
Stalin's well-thought-out plan aimed at splitting and pitting the two main groups of imperialist powers, the Axis and the Allies, against each other, allowing them to weaken each other and opening the way for the Red Army into a bleeding Europe, failed, which is why the Soviet leadership decided in the spring of 1941 to strike first against Hitler, while he was occupied with the First or Western Front. Only in 1992, after the Great Archival Revolution, did the above-mentioned guesses from the book The Icebreaker cease to be guesses and became documented facts. The only question that The Icebreaker cannot provide a reasonable answer to is the cause of the catastrophe at the beginning of the Soviet-German War. In Suvorov's work, there is only a superficial and unfounded thesis that the Stalinist army was purely offensive and unprepared for defensive battles. The answer to this question lies on the surface, specifically in the field regulations of the Red Army, RKKA. The most valuable asset in the RKKA is the new man of the Stalin era. He plays the decisive role in battle. Without him, all technical means of warfare are useless, but in his hands, they become a formidable weapon. The entire personnel of the RKKA is educated in the Bolshevik spirit of activity, bold initiative, unwavering determination, indomitable perseverance, and constant striving to strike the enemy. The entire personnel of the RKKA must stubbornly cultivate iron will and steel character in themselves. They must be ready for selfless devotion and the exceptional exertion of all their physical and moral strength in battle. Field Regulations of the RKKA, 1939, Chapter 1, Paragraph 6. The exhausted Soviet peasant, bound in kolkhoz slavery, had no motivation to fight and give his life for his tormentors, regardless of the banner under which the tormentors were marching. This is why the quantitative, and in some cases, qualitative superiority of the USSR in weaponry was nullified by the fact that this weapon became a useless pile of metal due to the lack of people ready to use it for anything other than surrendering or fleeing to the rear. Does the thickness of armor or maneuverability matter if, within the first week of the war, around 500 tanks were left on the Bialystok-Vyalkovsk highway? We'll talk about that in the next video. Like and subscribe if you don't want to miss the continuation, and leave a comment below with your thoughts on the topic and opinion about what you've heard in the video. Goodbye.